In this video, we are going to talk about Franken muscles. Now, Franken muscles are when you specify multiple muscle IDs on a single piece of geometry. So in this case, you can see we have our muscles split up into a handful of different pieces, and then on each of those pieces, there are further muscle IDs specified to get all of the muscles in total. Now, the general thinking behind Franken muscles is that you get the benefit of reducing the number of collisions that you need to solve between different muscles. You also reduce the number of muscle-to-muscle constraints you need to keep muscles together because the nature of the geometry is already keeping all of these together, for instance. So now you only need to have your muscle-to-muscle constraints between these separate pieces. But then there are also some downsides. The one is that often to get the surface detail you need to go quite high res in your mesh. You can see this is very high res. If you're in a situation where you're already working at this resolution, then it could definitely be worthwhile trying out Franken muscles for your setup. But for instance, with the Minotaur setup that we had, we were working pretty low res, and in order to maintain that fidelity of the shapes, this type of shape, you might need to up-res a little bit. The other downside is, well, obviously, if everything here was one single Franken muscle, well, in the sense of one single piece with multiple Franken muscles on them, then you wouldn't be able to get any sliding of muscles, right? The way it's set up here, the way these pieces are split is so that you can get these layers and you can get sliding here. So basically, depending on your setup, you might lose the ability for muscles to slide. So that's kind of a way that you'd have to determine how you want to split up your pieces, if at all. But remember, if you don't split up your pieces whatsoever, you're not going to get any muscle sliding. Then there are different ways to specify your Franken Muscle IDs. One of the ways is with Franken Paint, and that is quite slow, especially if you have quite a large number of TETs and you are painting a large number of muscle IDs. But I will show some workarounds to help with this. So let's get started. I'm going to go to a simple setup first. So this is just one portion of the deer's leg, and we've remeshed it, we've solidified it. Now we can use a Franken Muscle Paint to paint the different areas. So looking at this one, firstly, you can see that I'm not the one that did the setup because I would never just leave everything with non-descriptive name like new ID 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. But it is quite hard to figure out what all of these muscles are. So I can understand why that might be the case. But if we go here to the active ID, we can see it will show the different ones. Now, one of the things I personally don't like that much about the Franken Muscle Paint is you can't see all of the Franken Muscle IDs at the same time. So my workaround for that is to create a Franken Muscle node and connect it. I'm just going to Control C to get rid of that error. And now it will display in random colors all of the muscle IDs, right? So this is quite handy. And then you can even use that if you have the Franken muscle displayed while your paint is active and you're painting, you can paint and it will update. Okay, now here I have my own attempt at it. If we look at mine, you see I didn't have any gaps between mine. And that's kind of the benefit, I think, of having Franken muscle displayed while you're painting is you can actually see where they meet. But John still managed to get a pretty good simulation even with it painted like this. So I don't think it really matters too much if you have gaps between them. If we even go and look in the geometry spreadsheet, we'll see, let's look at the attributes. So the one thing that we will see if we look at the detail attributes is that there is a detail attribute called Franken Muscle created, and it is an array that contains all the muscle ID names that are Franken muscles. And now the order of this is going to be important. So let's just inspect this. Leave it up here. Now, if we go to our point attributes, we'll see that there is Franken index and Franken weight. So the index is the index of this array here. So what it's saying is the muscle IDs that this point belongs to are the ones indexed by 0, so this one, and 1. For this one, it's 6 and 0. So this one is 6, and it's not to do with the name new ID 6. It's 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 0. And here the weight is saying how much it is driven by that muscle. Okay, so let's look at this one, for instance. We have 0, 4, and 5. 0 is 1, so it's got whatever properties muscle 0 has, it's going to fully obey those. Then for 4, it's only 0.4, so it's going to get 0.4 of the properties of that muscle ID. And then 5 is only 0.02. So it's going to get very little from that and nothing at all from the others. So basically what you can see here is you can have multiple muscle IDs affecting the same point, and even you can have more than one at a weight of 1. So they don't have to add up to 1 or anything like a skin weight or something would. So it's just good to keep in mind that there's a bit more going on under the hood than what you can see in your viewport. Here's that. I just want to show a little bit the usage of the Franken Muscle Paint. So like I said, I like to have the Franken Muscle displayed. One thing to be aware of. So let me just make a new one. And I'll just... So what we want is I'm not going to... I might be wrong with these names. It's just what I could figure out the closest match. So to create a new one, we can either press A or press the plus button here. The reason I kind of prefer pressing plus rather than pressing A is that it's reminding you to already rename it. If you do it in your viewport, you're going to forget to rename it, and you can't rename it after you've started painting. Let me show you what I mean. I'm going to start painting this, and now I realize, oh, I wanted to give this a name. L vastus lateralis. Now it's disappeared, right? So this is something to be very careful of. Never rename after you've already painted, or you'll lose what you've painted for that specific ID. Anyway, let's paint it with this one. And you see we're using a volume brush because it's a solid and we want to be painting the internal tests too. Okay, and let's actually display the Franken muscle. So you'll see even though I'm painting it, it won't always update it to that color. And that's partly because of the whole weight thing. It's sort of figuring out under the hood how strong, if the weights are strong enough to make it count as being predominantly this ID or not. So this is something that I still find a little bit confusing about this, that I want to sort of understand better before I really make any big conclusive statements about it. So I kind of recommend you experimenting and getting a feel for it yourself and seeing what works best for your situation. Because it's hard to say something that will be true for everyone in every situation. Okay, so now I'm going to add another one. And I've forgotten what names they are. Let's see, it's biceps femoris. Let's do that one. Okay, so remember, you have to rename it here before you start painting. So the thing is, if you paint and you have a a value that's neither 0 nor 1, a non-integer value. So say I do some smoothing. Even though it's not displaying it in this color here, it is going to have a weight here of that muscle ID still. Okay, but just for sake of clarity, I will just fill it in. Okay. And so on and so forth until you get to something like that. Great. So the nice thing now is the fiber groom is going to understand that these are separate pieces in the sense of that they're separate muscle IDs, even though they're not separate pieces in terms of connectivity. But the fiber groom will automatically try to do the best fiber direction the same way that it would with regular non-Franken muscles. And then you can just add a little bit of a, whoops, I didn't mean to do that. Just to add a bit of strokes to improve the look as you need, but it should give you a pretty good starting point, which is really useful. If you toggle this off, let's just say clear all strokes, you see now when I stroke it, it's going to affect the entire piece, which I doubt you'll want in most situations. So just leave it off. So now we've got that, and it doesn't really matter which way these are going, as long as it's the one way or the other. It doesn't matter if it's pointing this way or if it's pointing that way. It's just because this is an older file and it was made without the axial ramp correction. Okay, now the muscle properties are going to be basically exactly the same. You'll see it's even figured out the tendon mask for you, which is pretty neat that it's figured it out even if it's just pieces. Again, you can see this isn't a setup done by me because these aren't all toggled on as I like to do. But it's not going to break if you do this. It's just going to be a little bit confusing if you do suddenly turn this on and it's not giving you the behavior that you had before. Okay. Now, the muscle constraint properties. This is quite interesting because the muscle to muscle, in this case, there's one single connected piece, right? So that means there are not going to be any muscle to muscle constraints. The only time we have muscle to muscle constraints with Franken muscles is if there are multiple pieces, right? So let me even show you in the deer my muscle constraint properties here. Just needs to cook for a second. Now you can see the only places where you get these muscle to muscle constraints are between the different pieces. Okay, and it wouldn't make sense to make them between Franken muscles in the same piece because the geometry is already intrinsically holding it together. Okay, then for muscle to bone, you will still get that because the bones are separate, but you might find that you don't need it as much in this kind of setup as you would with smaller muscles. Then the muscle ends. Now, in this case, it's going to try to do a similar thing as before. You might find that it doesn't quite get all the muscle ends right, but to be honest, it actually doesn't matter. It doesn't really make sense for this to even be a muscle end because there isn't a bone close by, right? So this isn't actually even going to do anything. And in fact, you'll probably find that you'll want to add some extra muscle ends with a muscle paint like there is here. You can see if you toggle this on and off, some extra muscle ends have been painted in at the top and the bottom of the entire piece. In this case, the muscle flex has been set up just with animated flex attributes. I mean, flex parameters. Here is one with tension lines. And the deer has one with tension lines too, the full deer. But let's just take a look at what we get with these animated, these keyframed flex parameters. Okay. And now note there's no target shape at all on this, right? We never specified a target shape. Oh, there's a target shape attribute, but there isn't a target shape specified. If we extract the target shape, we'll see that it's the same thing. You see, the target shape attribute isn't actually a different value. Okay, so let's see what happens when we simulate this. I will let it cache and then come back when it's cached out to play it. Okay, so this sim has been cached to memory, as you can see with this blue line. And let's play it and take a look. And you can see that the muscles are contracting quite nicely in their individual areas. It is worth noting that because they are all connected, you do see some effect of movement in one area on another area, even though this area isn't firing at the beginning, it's still moving up with the rest of the muscle. So depending on your system, that may be something you want or don't want, and it's just something to bear in mind. Okay, so now let's look at our next example, and that is with Tommy. So we've just kept his skin, removed eyes, removed the inside of his mouth, and polyfilled it, and now we're just going to muscle solidify him and just make his entire body one solidified pet mesh. Okay? So this is probably not something you're going to do on a hero character, but you can get pretty neat results. So let's take a look. Now, here we have the different muscles painted, and it's not all of them, it's just a couple. You can see here, these are the ones that are painted. And again, here I was just doing my own example off to the side, but it's basically very similar to what I showed before. Don't know why it's taking a while to cook. So this is the downside of having this one massive pet mesh, especially at this resolution. It does slow down quite a bit. And I think also because I've got this cache to memory, it's not helping. So I'm going to clear that by control clicking down here to clear that sim from memory, and hopefully that will make things a bit less slow. Okay, so the different areas are painted in, and now the fiber groom is automatically getting some of it, and you can tweak it as you need. And he doesn't have a proper skeleton, so there's just a very simple armature made for him here. It's not even going to be animated, but it's just going to help keep him upright, and we'll see that a bit later. Muscle properties, you can see it's very simple here. Muscle constraint properties are very simple. Muscle flex, we just have keys on these muscle flex parameters so that we get this. So this is all just hand keyed. And now let's do a Vellum solve, and I'll come back when it is cached to memory. Okay, so the sim is cached to memory, and now let's take a look. So you can see that his arms and legs are very floppy, but the contractions in his abs and pecs and upper arms are causing his legs and his lower arms to flop around. Now, this specific example is not going to be useful in every situation, but you might find something where this could be very useful to you. You know, you might have some type of puppet on a string, or maybe a zombie or something. And this is obviously very simple, but if you add a slightly more complete skeleton, it can still be very straightforward and shaped like this, but just a bit more extended, and you can add some animation to it. You can get some pretty neat results. Okay, I'm going to clear this again. And now let's take a look at the next example. So this one is a bit more involved. We've got our capybara, just blasting away unnecessary things, subdividing it so that we can add a bit of detail. So in this case, we are going to use a target shape, unlike previous examples, which didn't have any target shapes. So here, I'm very impressed by whoever did this. It might be John, it might be someone else, but they did this sculpting using an edit node. So kudos, but just going to make use of that. So this is the target shape of the flexed muscles. And now we have our normal rest mesh that we muscle solidify. And then in the same way as we showed in the target shape video, we use an FEM deform to deform this target shape to the solidified geometry. This is a little bit slow. We have quite a few tests here. Okay. So there we go. And now we're going to save it as a target shape attribute. Now here we already have muscle geometry, right? So because we have it, we can actually use this instead of a Franken Muscle Paint to specify our Franken muscles. So this is very, very useful. You know, maybe you have muscles, but they're penetrating one another, or they are not quite the right shape or whatever, but they're separate pieces and they have names. You can use that. So what we're doing here, if you specify in your second input of a Franken muscle something with IDs, it's going to transfer those muscle IDs to the solid mesh. And then you can see the resulting colors, the results of that transfer plus the blend between them. And you can tweak these values to get it to look nice. And you can isolate just in the viewport. It's not actually changing the output, but just for what you're seeing, you can isolate different things to see what they look like. Okay, so now let's say we have this, but we just want to tweak it a bit. So now this is where Franken Muscle Paint is great, because you're not going to be painting every single one of the muscles. You just want to paint a couple. So here there's just a single muscle ID created, fingers and toes, where the hands and the feet have been masked out. Okay, now fiber groom, same as before. Muscle properties, same as before. Here we have some bone animation. The muscle constraint properties, I think this is a little bit strange. You can see there are some constraints internally too, but it shouldn't be too much of a problem because it shouldn't be the muscle to bone shouldn't be contracting with these default values. So I think this will be fine. And then we just want to tweak the end mask, because the end mask created here is actually not very useful. So what we're going to do instead is just paint the regions we want to pin, basically, to the animation. And this is also going to drive the animation, remember? So we've got the hands and the feet and the head. Okay, so a combination of the muscle ends being these sort of pinned regions, and then the muscle to bone constraints on the rest of the thing, which will be a less strong constraint, are going to drive the muscles, or in this case, just the sort of single body muscle mass, are going to be driven by the bones. Here we've got some tension lines, and we can see that that's set up to cause some flexing. So this is all still pretty standard. All right. And for this one, I've had the foresight to actually pre-cache it to disk. So let's have a look at the results. And you can see we're getting those defined shapes coming in from the target shapes, which is really neat. It's really cool that we can get this. Is it the most sophisticated muscle sim you've ever seen? No. So you wouldn't do this on a hero character, but you could get some pretty cool results in a lot of situations with it. So it's definitely something worth considering. Okay, on to our next example. So I have shown how you can use the skin, and I've shown the sort of amalgamated muscle mass from different shapes. But how would you actually create something like this? So let's say we're in a situation where we have muscle shapes to begin with, and we want to create a Franken muscle out of it. Maybe it's, we might not even want to do it for all of our muscles in a model, but just for some of them to simplify things a bit. So here I've split off just the obliques from my Minotaur. And I am going to make these into a single mesh with the VDB from polygons. So now this is going to turn this into VDBs. I tweak my voxel size to get something that maintains the shape fairly well. Remember, the smaller your voxel size, the heavier it's going to be to calculate, the slower it's going to be to calculate. So don't go too small too quickly. Then this VDB reshape in dilate mode is going to add kind of like a peak, but it's nicer than a peak, and that you won't get sort of self-intersections almost of a peak. And now you can say convert VDB to polygons, and it's going to create a polygon surface for you. So now this is pretty cool. You can work with this. This is fine. But I thought, just because I wanted to be a bit extra, let's try a quad remesher on this. So I'll start off by bypassing these, and you can see what the result was. So you get these pretty good in general. You get some funky behavior in these crevices. So the way I fixed that was with a comb node, which you can use to comb the normals, and then I promoted those point normals to primitives and called them remesh guide. And then on the quad remesh under guide, the attribute name is remesh guide. So now it's using those vectors that I brushed on the surface to guide it within the flow, right? So without it, with it. And if you look at this, it looks a bit funny, just like that. Let me turn on normals. That's better. So now you can see how that comb brushed these normals flat to describe the flow. Okay, and I'll just do a little demonstration. Ta-da! So I basically was a bit more careful than this, but I just sort of did this. But I wasn't too careful. And even just this little bit of love really helped the quad remesher. Okay. So now we have pretty good looking quads, but I do recommend using a polydoctor on this to check. So let's create a polydoctor. And I like to turn on visualize for everything so we can see. And I don't want to repair anything. I just want to mark issues, because I find that it's when it tries to repair, it doesn't always do a very good job anyway. So it's better just to have it show dodgy areas. And that's looking pretty neat. If I bypass this, you'll see that there were a bunch of dodgy areas. So that comb really helped with the dodgy areas. Now what I've also done, I think I turned these off and I just created a group for this valid poly. And then I have a blast node here to blast the valid poly group. So now blasting away all the valid polys, and we're left with no invalid polys. But if we turn this off, we do have some. So this is a quick way to see if there are any invalid polys. So this is fix the invalid polys. Now this is the same settings as this one. I'll just show how I used it. So we now have that, sorry, this one is a little bit bigger than the original ones that we had. So I just added a slight peak to it just to bring it in. But then the polydoctor on this, same settings as I had here, but we can do the blast on that. We have a couple of new invalid points. So here I've actually kept the polydoctor in the mainstream because I'm using that group. And what I have here is my base group is not the valid poly group. So basically the invalid polys, and I'm calling them problem areas. And this is a group expand node. So I'm actually just growing it a bit so that it encompasses the surrounding regions. I'm going to promote them to points because I want to put it in a delta mush, and delta mush can only work with point groups. Okay, and now I'm going to use my original quad remesh that didn't have any of the problems as my second input. You'll just notice that it will complain if Oh, now it's not complaining. Never complains when you're demonstrating. Well, if you find that it complains, it could be because it doesn't have the same group. So I just copied my problem areas onto the Quad Remesh over there. And now this just smooths out those problem areas a bit. And you can double check with the polydoctor again if you want. You just have to actually delete your everything. Here I've deleted everything except P because I wanted to delete those the colors. So now when I look at the polydoctor here, you can see that that is great because if you don't delete them, it's still going to possibly have the old ones. Maybe not. I don't know. And now I just also, what I did here with the sculpt node is I just got rid of some of these little funkinesses. So I'll just reset this. And with the relax mode, I just went relax these areas because I'm a perfectionist. Now we have a pretty good looking topology. And for this area, we can smooth it a bit. Remember always with the smooth, set your strength pretty low when you start. Otherwise, you're just going to smooth everything up into oblivion. Okay. There we go. Now again, I've just deleted everything and I should maybe also do a group delete to get rid of groups. Great. So now we have a nice quad geometry. And you really don't need to have done this quad remesh. I just was sort of playing around with it and thought I would demonstrate its strength to you. It is still in beta mode, so I'm quite impressed with what I got done despite it being in beta mode. But yeah, you don't need to do this. This is just if you want to maybe publish it so that you have a nice locked down geometry that you can paint on if you ever need to. But it's completely fine to just work with it in this form that you got from your convert VDB. But now we're going to have our muscle solidify, and we can use these input original obliques as our second input in the Franken muscle, and it can pick up the muscle IDs from that, and we can even see how it has done so. And now, let's say those were the only muscles you wanted to do the Franken mesh on. You can solidify all the other muscles and then muscle merge them together. Or you can do a similar thing for another group of muscles and just basically merge together all the Franken muscles as well as any non-Franken muscles with a muscle merge. Now remember, it is very, 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 very important to use a muscle merge when merging Franken muscles. If you have Franken muscle anywhere, you must use muscle merge. And that is because, like I showed at the beginning of the video, the Franken muscle creates a dictionary. And when you merge multiple ones together, you want to keep that dictionary, and it's going to have to reorder the indices, etc. So don't use a merge, use a muscle merge. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk. No, but in all seriousness, this is, for the rest, you'll carry on as usual, like we did for the rest of our setup. Okay, so the nice thing about Franken muscles is you're not limited to only using Franken muscles. The Franken muscle system is completely integrated within the rest of the muscle system. So you can pick and choose which muscles you want to use Franken muscles for or not. Okay, another example. And in this case, we are using a Franken Muscle Paint on existing muscles. So in this case, we have this muscle geometry, and let's say you realize, oh, this is all one single piece, but I actually want to be able to get the separate pieces of the abdomen to fire independently, for instance. Okay, so now number one, I recommend splitting it out to do the Franken Muscle Paint on that, because here I was trying to paint with all the muscles and it was getting very slow. Okay, so I split this out first so that I just have the piece of geometry I'm interested in. And then I just painted these 4 abdominal muscles, not very anatomically precise, but just to give you an idea. You can see in the Franken muscle, this Franken muscle isn't necessary. It's really just for display so that you can see. And then you can combine it back with your original muscles. But remember, like I just said, use a muscle merge and not a regular merge, because you don't want to mess up your muscle IDs, your Franken muscle IDs. Okay. And just the fiber groom to show that it's picking those up as separate muscle IDs, and continue with the sim as normal. And again, you could do this on other muscles too if you wanted. Okay, so I'm just showing, maybe it's that you want to create a big piece out of existing muscle pieces, or maybe you have existing muscles and you don't want to separate it out into separate muscle shapes. You just want to paint what you have to get more definition and control. Okay, so let's look at this example. Here I'm going to show an alternative to the Franken Muscle Paint if you don't already have muscles with muscle IDs pre-specified, like we did in this capybara example. So I'm going to start with the same thing and then subdivide for a bit of extra detail. Now, basically what I'm going to do is I'll show a little bit further along what I got. I got these different, I cut out the different regions for the different muscles and then used those as my Franken Muscle ID instead of painting. So let's look at how I did that. So the first thing that I did, which is quite neat, is if you type attribute sharpen, you will get an attribute blur node with some settings enabled that will allow you to actually do the opposite of attribute blur. So instead of blurring, it's going to sharpen your features. And you can use this to basically emphasize muscles on a mesh. And all that I did here beforehand was I created this ambient occlusion mask just to, let's go to smooth shaded, just to, I wanted to reduce the strength of the attribute sharpen in the armpits and the groin and things like that. So the ambient occlusion is pretty great for that. So you can see without it, it just made the armpits and stuff collide. And it's not the end of the world for what I'm going to do for that to happen, but better not to. So that's what I did with these two. And now I still just want to fix these penetrations here. So what's useful for self-penetrations is the winding number node. This will give a number that shows how much point is within another surface. So when you do it to itself, it will show self-intersections. And if I go into wireframe mode, in any case, it is showing where those issues are. So I've just gone and then back to smooth shaded. I've gone and blurred that, remapped it, blurred it some more, remapped it some more. And then I used a lerp to blend it using that winding number. So it blends it between this and the original unsharpened mesh. And now it's just a bit less intense in that penetrating region. Now I've just deleted unnecessary attributes. And now I have basically a target shape for my surface. I haven't solidified it yet, but I have the surface target shape. Now let's use this sort of emphasized muscle to actually find the regions on the skin that delineate the different muscles. So what I've done here is I've created a measure node, set it to curvature with the type to principal, that's set to default, tweak the width a bit, and it's going to output curvature to curvature attribute as a point attribute. Okay, and you can see it's not sort of a perfect mask for where muscles are and where the separation between muscles are, but it's a pretty good first pass. Okay, so I just blur that a bit to I don't know what it's remembering that from. Okay, so I've just blurred the curvature a bit, then I remapped it to get rid of the sort of negative signs. I've given it a new name, cut, and then I just remapped it again with a bit more control. Let's look at cut now. I can actually, so this is cut here, and then I just wanted to get these turquoise regions to red. So I did that with another remap. So now we've got a pretty good starting point for the separation areas between the muscles. And now you can take an attribute paint and you can see that I just went in and I sort of closed some gaps and I cleaned up some regions where I didn't want it. And I didn't do it for the whole body because I'm really just doing this for demonstration purposes. So I can leave that as an exercise for you. And I also found because there's less detail on the legs to begin with, I didn't have time to look up an anatomy reference for the legs. So I will leave that as an exercise for the viewer, but I'm able to demonstrate the principle at least. So now I'm just creating a group from the cut attribute, anywhere where the cut attribute is greater than 0.9, put it in a group called cut, and then blast away cut. And now we have these separate pieces. Okay, and now we can use a muscle ID node to name these. Okay, so you can see I've already done a couple, and I'm forgetting the names of all these muscles off the top of my head. We can maybe call this, oh, this is one piece. So we probably want to split it. Okay, so now the thing to note is if we go back and make changes, we're going to lose what we've already named. Okay, you can sort of go and sort of copy these nodes and repeat it after the muscle ID again to refine it, or you just go back and only do the naming once you're satisfied. So let's complete the shape here. It's getting a bit tricky to see. It looks like it's connecting up there. Great. I really should have an anatomy reference in front of me now for this, but oh yes, let's bring this up. Something like that. Something like that. And you can also see all the little changes that I've already painted in. Okay, so now you'll see that the muscle ID got scrambled. Okay, so we'll just have to clear this. Start again. So unfortunately, the mirror doesn't really work in this situation. So you'll just have to either blast and mirror or manually rename both sides. But I still find this much preferable to the Franken Muscle Paint. So what was I doing? Deltoid. bicep, triceps, and so on and so forth. Okay. So now when we do the Franken muscle, we get these different regions, which is pretty great. I've just noticed that the bicep is sort of affecting this region a bit too much. So that's maybe a downside of using this bulkier version of him. So what we might want to do, so I'm going to have to change my setup slightly. Let me just show what I did first and then I'll change it. So basically, in this case, I solidified this bulky version and did the muscle ID. So I'm actually going to store the current point position as the target shape. And then I'm going to create a rest shape and I use this original mesh here. And then I even went further by delta mushing it to smooth it even more so that this is my rest state. And I did the FEM deform of the solid muscles to this shape. Let's just wait for it to cook. This is the downside of high res mesh. Okay. And now I'm actually going to save that as my T-pose instead. And then you can see when I say extract T-pose, it's going to set it to that. That's a completely valid way of doing it. But the only problem is that this Franken muscle, because these muscles were so bulgy, it's affecting the lats a bit. So what I'm going to do instead is after my subdivide, I'm going to set my T-pose. And now it's cooking everything again, so let's not do that. And I'm just going to reconnect those there. Okay, so now over here, I'm going to extract the T-pose. Okay, just to bring it down a notch. And I'm going to do the same thing over here. So now I'm going to solidify this T-pose. Let's see if that has helped the bicep at all. Did it cause a scramble? Or did I? Okay, it is still going a bit in, so I don't know how much the problem is from the... Might have to tweak these a bit instead. If you go too low, it can sometimes start to look a bit key. You see now it's not very red anymore. So let's stick with one. And now instead of this, oh, I didn't do the delta mesh. Here, I'll do this instead. So now I'm not actually changing the point positions, but I'm storing this delta mushed version as my T-pose. Okay, so it still looks the same, but it's saving this in there. So now when I extract T-pose here, maybe that will be better. Yeah, I think that is a bit better. Okay, great. And now I also don't, now I want it on the target shape to be on this. We don't need this one anymore because the T-pose will automatically be created correctly from the muscle solidify, and we can just store the target shape this way. And now if we, oh, what's going on? Need to recook it probably. Okay, so now that will save it as a target shape. That will stay the same, but if I now Yes? No? Maybe this wasn't strong enough. It's possible that I did this the wrong way around too. Target surface, rest surface. Yes, I did it the wrong way around. Target surface. Hitting escape so that it doesn't cook. And rest surface. Reset. I could also have use that as the rest surface. It's too late now. There we go. That's more like what I was expecting. Now we store the target shape, and when we extract the target shape, that is what we get. Okay, and this is just sort of for visualization purposes. But now we put down a null here, and then you do the rest of the muscle setup below as you would normally. So I hope that wasn't too confusing, but that is how you can go about basically bypassing the Franken Muscle Paint. And you can always still add a Franken Muscle Paint after this to tweak it. Like if I wanted to get rid of that little biceps area, I can always go paint it out. But this way, the fewer number of strokes you have in a Franken Muscle Paint, the faster it will be. It basically starts slowing down the more strokes you have. So the less painting there is to do in general, the fewer strokes you'll have. So now let's take a look at John Mariella's Dear Franken Muscle setup. Now, I do not have the access to the files that he used to originally create this geometry, but I suspect he used something very similar to what I just showed you on Tommy. And at least for the part where he has his muscle surfaces, which I just need to find. Spacebar F, here. Okay. So I think he created this from the skin in a very similar way. And then sort of did some sculpting to get it to have a bit more of this layered effect. And I think to create these muscles, he took a skin geometry and sort of cut it up and did something similar with the attribute Sharpen to really get that definition. Okay, so sorry that I can't show exactly how this was created because this is all I have, but I hopefully gave you an idea with the example before. So here we have these separated pieces, and let's create a relaxed target shape because we already have the more defined one. So here we can just blur this, peek it out a bit. Here, some areas have been painted that we want to blur some more. Blur it with that mask attribute. Now here we've painted some regions where we want to restore it to the initial position. Remap that and restored those regions, and then just deleted all the attributes that we no longer needed. So here are our surface muscles that are relaxed, and here are our surface muscles that are flexed. So we are going to solidify these flexed ones. In this case, we can start off with the target shape essentially, and then later define the T-pose like I did before in the tummy. So here, solidified, got our tetrahedra, and now here it's using an enumerate. In previous videos, I used enumerate with an attribute called index. Here it's called underscore PID. Doesn't really matter what it's called, as long as you know what it is when you need to access it. Okay, and now there is this for each loop. So firstly, let me show you why it's needed. So if you just do an FEM deform of the solidified muscles with the relaxed one, what you get is, once it's done cooking, okay, you see here, you get these sort of spiky stuff. It's because it's not doing it piece by piece. So it's doing it, so this muscle is influencing this muscle, and That is why we get that. So instead, we've got a for each loop here, which is going to go over each piece. And by each piece, we mean each connected piece. And it's just going to blast away all the other pieces that aren't needed on all the relevant inputs, and then do an FEM deform. So it's basically the same as this FEM deform, but it's just doing it on each isolated piece. Okay, and then now remember in this case, we've already done the muscle solidify on the target shape. So here we're going to store the current P position as the target shape. And then we're going to use this deformed, the solid muscles that are deformed to the T pose to update the positions. And we've just used the PID because in this merging, we can change the point order. So this is just to make sure that we're copying the correct values to the correct points. And now just deleted that. We don't need it anymore. And here file, just did a file cache because that whole process was quite slow. And here I just went ahead and set the current position to the T-pose. Okay, so now we have our solid muscles. Okay, now let's get these Franken muscle attributes set up. So we have these separated pieces that show all the muscle IDs, and this muscle ID node was used, well, it just sets the default name. It wasn't really used to name anything properly. It's just L Musk with a number. I guess this is fine if you, like, it's not going to break anything. It's just going to be very confusing. So anyway, here are all the pieces, and then we're just going to isolate one piece, and we're going to isolate the corresponding muscle ID pieces. And then we input those into a Franken muscle, and voila, we have our Franken muscles. And then we do the same thing for the next piece. And this way, we're not going to get certain pieces affecting the wrong, we could probably just do it all in one step, but then we're going to get weird behaviors in overlapping areas. So it's safest just to split them up by each individual muscle piece, and so on and so forth. And then what do? We use a muscle merge, okay? You'll see in the geometry spreadsheet how this is going to merge all of these together. Okay, before this one only had those. You see, so now we're combining all of them, and now the indices in the point index, these Franken indices, no longer make sense because now the order of the muscles in the array is different. So this is going to fix all of that. Okay. Now you see you'll have Franken indices as high as 105, whereas before none of these had such high Franken indices. Okay. So that is why it's very important to use the muscle merge and not a regular merge. I'm sorry if I sound like a broken record, but you're going to be very unhappy if you try to use a regular merge and not understand why it's all breaking. Okay, and here I just have a little preview so that we can see all the muscles. And also here is a preview to see the target shape. Now, basically from here on, everything is going to be very similar to a regular muscle setup. The only difference, as I've mentioned before, is the muscle to muscle isn't as complicated because it's far fewer pieces that have the muscle to muscle setups, and the muscle ends don't mean quite as much. And so you might want to paint in some new muscle ends. I'm trying to see if he did that here. Yes, he did, just to get it to stick to the bone here. And he also did some muscle glue for regions where he didn't want sliding between the pieces. You can see it's sort of there, but then everywhere else it can still move freely. Well, with some constraints from the muscle to muscle constraints, but not as stiff a constraint as with the muscle glue. Here we're just ensuring that it's in the T pose. This FEM validate is to check that there are no inversions. There are a couple. Interestingly, I didn't know this before. You can just blast those inverted ones away. That's great. I did not know that. So we've removed the inversions. Here, the muscle flex is coming from these tension lines. Again, you can see that I did not do the setup because they're all named autoflex, whatever number. But again, that's a valid way of working. It's just a confusing way of working. And now we see we're getting these activations. So because this is quite high res, it took a while to sim. Not too long, but long enough that I'm not going to do it live here. So let's take a look at the result. You can see we're getting some nice definition here, and then it's going away and there. I must say this is quite an impressive result. We've got these areas moving nicely over one another. You can see there's some nice sliding there. So yeah, all in all, this is quite a great result. So in summary, Franken muscles can be used in combination with regular muscles. It fits more or less seamlessly into the rest of the muscle system. So you don't need to use it on all your muscles. You can use it just on areas that you need to. You can do Franken muscle on the entire skin if you want. It's not going to give you the most hero results, but it can be interesting. And it can give fairly useful results for many situations. You can also go and you can split areas up into fairly large pieces, but keep them separate in areas where you want to be able to have some sliding. And while there is a Franken muscle paint, it should be limited for use in cleaning up or specifying muscles in small areas and not for a full body because it's tedious and slow. So if you can proceduralize your muscle ID creation another way for your Franken muscles, that is preferred. I hope you have enjoyed this masterclass series, and I look forward to seeing the results of your work online.